Good afternoon. I would like to welcome you to our joint webinar, The Top 10 Best Practices for Data Classification. My name is George Nikonoroff, and I will be the moderator for today. During today's presentation, we encourage you to send your questions on the topic as they will be answered sequentially at the end. You can send us your questions by clicking on the Questions tab in the box in the right-hand corner. We have an exciting and engaging presentation planned for you today, but before we jump into the topic, first up, I would like to introduce you to David Thornberry, Regional Sales Director for Watchful Software, who will introduce us to RiceWatch. David?
Thank you, George. Hello, everyone who has agreed to participate in today's valuable content on how to implement data classification. This presentation today is brought to you by Watchful Software and Sphere Technology Solutions. And I thought it prudent to give you all a 60-second flyby of who Watchful Software is and how we fit into today's presentation. Okay, Watchful Software is a company that is primarily helping organizations try to understand what data is truly sensitive within your organization, who should have access to that information, how that data should be handled, when the classification of a particular asset should be changed or reclassified, either upward or downward, and who or where that information should be protected. And just to give you some perspective of how we endeavor to accomplish that, we do so with a multifaceted solution which will do real-time identification of that information that your organization has deemed sensitive in nature. It might be intellectual property, something proprietary within your organization. And that information is identified by content, which could be keywords, phrases, regular expressions, context, which might be who it's coming from, where it's going, the size of the file, or metadata that you have in a particular asset. And then that information or asset is then automatically classified. We have an automated solution to ensure that your corporate policies are being adhered to by your users, so that we don't put the burden on your user to ensure that they're protecting your information. And then we have the capacity to custom tag your asset, and that can be done by watermarking. Watermarking can be tailored to your liking. You can use different type styles, font sizes, colors. You can use custom watermarks across the header, the footer, or the body of the content, or you can actually use images as well. And then if you so choose to protect your information with encryption, we will apply RMS templates. This is seamless to the end user. He or she does not have to do anything to make certain that only those authorized to receive their documents or emails are able to open them and view them. And then we are going to log the movement of the asset, and that is done by capturing everything in a database. And each asset, when I say asset, I mean it could be an email, a Word document, PowerPoint presentation, Excel file, so on and so forth. Each has a globally unique identifier, so essentially it's a digital fingerprint to track the movements of that asset, who opened it, who tried to reclassify it, print it, forward it, so on and so forth. And then what we'll also do is apply some rudimentary DLP-like functionality in the way of blocking or warning the user that potentially certain recipients might not be able to open the asset because they aren't authorized to do so. So we're going to provide them with some educational warning messages as well as some blocking features to ensure that they don't make any mistakes with the content. So that gives you a general understanding of who we are. And if you have additional questions or would like to see the product in action, by all means, contact myself, David Thornberry, or Steve Horst, and we'd be delighted to show you our product in action. Now we'll turn it over to Patrick Fields from Sphere to introduce their company.
Great. David, thank you very much for that informative introduction to Watchful Software Rights Watch solution and the problems you're solving for your customers. My name is Patrick Fields. I'm a senior account manager with Sphere Technology Solutions. And before I turn this over to our featured presenter for today, who will share with you the top 10 best practices for implementing an effective data classification program, I would like to provide a brief introduction to Sphere Technology Solutions. Sphere Technology Solutions is a solutions provider focused on enhancing security and improving compliance for our customers. We achieve these objectives by developing and deploying governance models based on the analytics that identify and quantify risk. The three pillars of our offering are specialized professional services, the consulting and services that we deliver to produce the desired outcomes for our clients. Strategic software, these are the tools that we use to execute for our clients. This is a very interesting blend of both third-party solutions, like Watchful Software Rights Watch data classification, and Sphere's internally developed intellectual property. Custom integration describes the people, the processes, and the technology that must be deployed to support an effective governance model. When we view a client's technology landscape from a high level, we see three core components. Data. This is the information that all companies create and use each day in the operation of their business. Systems. This is where data lives. Systems can be on-premise, off-premise, or cloud. The most common scenario that we see in the marketplace is a combination of all three. And then access. Data and systems must be accessed by employees, partners, and customers. Access must consider the needs of each of these constituents. Now, in isolation, the management of these three core components appears very, very simple. However, one must consider governance. What is the target operating model that an organization must maintain for data, systems, and access? And what is the process by which you maintain the target operating model? Security. What are the threats an organization must defend against? Are these threats internal? Are they external? Most likely, they're both types of threats. And then compliance. What are the regulations that apply to your industry, and how do you abide by those regulations? Sphere tackles these challenges for our clients through a repeatable and proven four-phase methodology. Sphere identifies security and compliance concerns, remediates these risks, and creates the governance model to prevent a return of these challenges by first collecting and analyzing metadata from a target environment. This enables Sphere to produce the key risk indicators to measure risk. These key risk indicators are created by applying business intelligence to the collective metadata. There are three facets to business intelligence. There are industry best practices, there are Sphere's best practices, and there is our customers' business intelligence. The key risk indicators are communicated throughout the duration of the program. At the assessment phase, the KRIs are going to be static, as the assessment is simply a snapshot of the health of your organization at a single point in time. We then use the key risk indicators to create a plan to remediate the identified risks. Now, during remediation, the key risk indicators become very exciting because you're going to see all these metrics move in a positive direction as we execute upon the remediation plan. At the automation stage, you now have a governance model that is in place, and the organization can then manage by the key risk indicators, and risk mitigation is at that point a business as usual activity. Now I'd like to introduce our featured speaker who is going to provide you with the top 10 best practices for implementing an effective data classification program. Rita Gurvich is the founder and president of Sphere Technology Solutions. She holds dual degrees in computer science and mathematics from the Stevens Institute of Technology. Rita gained experience in the financial services industry, architecting, managing, and supporting world-class infrastructure in leading global organizations. She then shifted her focus to managing products for software vendors. At this point, she recognized the need to fill the gap between the typical software deployment and the customer's requirements. Thus, she founded Sphere Technology Solutions. Rita's vision and leadership in delivering governance, security, and compliance solutions has been widely recognized. Rita has been awarded the 2016 Smart CEO Bravo Award. She's been awarded 50 Best Women in Business by NJ Biz Magazine, and she's also a 2016 Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year finalist. So I'd like to now turn over the presentation to Rita so she can share with you the top 10 best practices for implementing an effective data governance program.
Thank you very much, Patrick. That was quite the introduction. Hopefully I can live up to these expectations that you've set for me today. So first of all, I'd like to thank everybody that joined today. I know how busy and hectic our work schedules are, so we really do appreciate you giving us this time so we can share some of our experiences, and hopefully you will leave this webinar today with learning something that will help you with your future programs. Right into it, there's a couple points I'd like to make, and I always try to take a step back and relate any major program that we're about to embark on to a project that you may be familiar with outside of the office. I typically talk about the Build-A-House example. I think it's very relatable to data classification among a handful of other programs that you run in your organizations. Before you lay the first brick, what are some of the things that you do? You do a ton of research and a ton of planning, figuring out what's your budget, where am I going to build, where is my general contractor, and what are they going to supply for us? And even once you start building your house, recognize that you're going to have to constantly evaluate and maybe even reconfigure some of the decisions that you've made. And when you start to lay the foundation, you go through inspection. And when you start framing, you go through inspection. You're going to notice a recurring theme here, and probably half, if not more, of the top 10 best practices I'm going to share with you today are really related to the research and planning aspects that have to go on, and also the ability and the comfort to constantly evaluate the decisions that you've made and how they're working, and if you are successful, making sure you can fine-tune as you move through this and improve continuously. The title of this slide, the top 10 best practices, is I think a little bit of a misnomer. From my perspective, what we're going to share with you today is really more of a process to follow as opposed to actual best practices. So what I'm going to do today is walk you through the top 10 steps in this process that we suggest you follow to make sure that you put together a strategy that's going to be successful. Just like any project, even the building a house example that I talked about before, the first thing you have to do is understand and even document the purpose of the exercise. So a lot of the folks on the call today, that may be very obvious why you're interested in data classification, but to your peers, to the business community, to the different stakeholders that are going to be involved in this program, that may not be the case. So what we recommend is always to set this up front and get it socialized early on. The other important aspect of defining these objectives is understand what are the have-to-haves versus the nice-to-haves, and always put your foot forward with your have-to-haves, the things that you can't argue that you have to do. We've listed a variety of U.S.-centric compliance needs and regulatory requirements in this slide here, but of course there are many others across the globe. I noticed that there were some folks registered today from various European countries. So you may be familiar with the EU Data Protection Directive as an example. There are other reasons that you may be interested in data classification as well. Maybe you have an open audit about sensitive content that may be overexposed, or maybe, unfortunately so, you've been the target of a data breach. Those are all very valid reasons to embark on a data classification program, and I would tend to think that those are have-to-haves as opposed to nice-to-haves. The last element that I'd like to talk about with setting your project objectives is your scope. That's really, really important, because just like with any other program, scope creep is a major issue. So make sure you identify that up front. Are you focusing on a specific department? Do you have various users that are considered highly sensitive because they work on M&A activity? Or maybe you have scientists that are working on a new drug, depending on what type of industry you're in. And maybe that's the reason that you're doing this. Maybe instead of a specific department, you're focused on a specific platform. Maybe that audit I was talking about earlier is related to unstructured data in areas that people collaborate, like file shares, for example. So make sure that you understand and document why it is that you're doing this and what your scope is going to look like. Now that you know the why, and hopefully you've been able to, again, document and socialize it, you're going to want to start to look at the how. And there are a number of prerequisites that you're going to want to think about as you go through to this next step. The very first aspect of a prerequisite is not necessarily technical. It's not necessarily a physical appliance or a tool. It's actually the team that's going to be involved in this program. I tend to think of data classification initiatives as a team sport. So I use the example of football and not golf. You're going to want to have different types of people with a variety of different skill sets and value adds that can provide feedback and be part of the implementation of this program. And within each of these silos, and we've listed a handful of them on this slide, you want to make sure that you find your champions. Ask yourself the question, who has the vested interest in the success of this initiative? Who has the right amount of institutional knowledge to get us through the process? Institutional knowledge is one of the most underrated skill sets that will help you with your programs. The people that understand the simplest aspects of how do I raise tickets for hardware, or what's the approval process for making a change to an endpoint, who are the people that have to approve budget. All of those elements in this prerequisite activity is so critical to the success of your project. And this step right here puts your army in place so you have the right stakeholders, you have the right champions that will help you get through any roadblocks that you may run into in the future. Next on the list is getting your materials together. And by materials, I don't just mean documents, but the hardware requirements, the software requirements, what tools are out there, and we're going to explore some options in the next slide. But once you've even thought about the types of tools that you're interested in deploying for data classification, you're going to want to think about what is needed to support these solutions in the short term and in the long term. And then this always comes back to the people element that I spoke about before with your putting the army in place. You want to make sure that there's always transparency and communication between all the different folks on the team. Educate, bring awareness, and start to think about how you're going to involve your business community. With data classification, it's not all behind the scenes. It's not just about deploying a DLP 1.0 tool to do these general scans. Yes, that's a very important part of data classification, but it's not all of it. We are going to ask your business users to change the way they work a little bit at least. So make sure that they are involved early on. And we'll get into some of those conversations and some of those options very, very shortly. I did mention tooling a moment ago, and that is a really important part of the process. Unless you're an organization with only 20 employees and you've only been around for a year or so, you can't do this manually. You have to figure out a programmatic and automated way to do this. And the other key element is you're going to want to do this over and over and over again. So scalability is very important, and doing things in a time-sensitive way is also important. So we're going to talk about what some of that means and how you go about choosing a solution. In this specific slide, I start to talk about the various options. And without listing out all the different software products out there, I want to focus more on the approach to choosing a software. The first bullet is talking about that DLP 1.0 tool. And I'm by no means saying that that is a bad solution, but it shouldn't be your only solution. I consider DLP 1.0 tools to be more of taking a blunt instrument across the board. The second element is almost the exact opposite of the DLP 1.0 tool, and it's being incredibly proactive and more than likely being incredibly intrusive and locking everything down off the bat. Restrict access to data, maybe encrypt everything, make it a challenge for your end users to access data so you know that what they are accessing is truly only the bare minimum of what they need. That sounds like a great risk mitigation strategy, but I can almost assure you your initial pilot users will put a big kibosh on that plan very quick because it will absolutely hinder their ability to work. The third bullet is almost like a middle ground, and it's a smarter way of tackling data classification, and it's a little bit of both of the previous two bullets. Doing things like content inspection on creation. So as an end user starts to include content that we consider sensitive, an action is taken at that moment. Maybe the file is flagged or tagged in a certain way, or there's some rules that are deployed about that file and what can be done with it. Maybe rules based on identities. We talked before about setting your scope. Let's say your scope involves that team of folks that are researching your next new drug, or the team that's focusing on M&A activity for your critical customers. Maybe figuring out who those people are, how to programmatically identify them with your IAM strategies, or even just using Active Directory integration. You can do more, smarter, and more scalably. And of course, Watchful Software is a great example of a tool that can help you here, and we could talk about that later on as well. But independent of tools, you need to think about the what-ifs as well as you plan. So again, it's not just about scanning, it's not just about locking everything down, those two extreme approaches, but having some logical ways of answering the questions. I've deployed data classification, I found these sensitive files, but then what? What happens when you find a piece of sensitive data? If the user is accessing this data and they shouldn't be, what happens next? What is the reactionary requirements that are going to come out of choosing this appropriate solution? In all reality, there's millions of options. You definitely have to weigh your risk versus reward. And one thing that has to be taken into account is the culture of your organization, in conjunction, of course, with the regulatory requirements that you're forced to live by. And you're going to have a little bit of a healthy debate and a weight game on how proactive can I be and how intrusive can I not be. And that's very, very important. But again, in reality, you're going to have budget constraints, you're going to have resource constraints, and you may just have bigger fish to fry. So figure all of that out up front, and that's going to really tell you what it is that you can and cannot deploy in any sort of amount of time. So let's move on a little bit, and I promise that very soon we're going to get to the deployment step. There's just a couple of other best practices or steps that I'd like to share with you on the planning and research part. And this one is pretty important around creating the right policies, and it's going to get you ready for your rollout and prepare you with everything you need to do to be able to be successful. The right policy has a few different aspects to it. Classification levels is the first one. It's okay to start simple and mature and grow over time. Many times we see a customer create these very, very long lists of different classification levels that range from public to private to sensitive to confidential to non-confidential, and sometimes, and those are the obvious ones, but sometimes we're even as specialists reading these documents and saying we can't logically differentiate between these levels, or how are you ever going to programmatically identify a file that fits in that classification level? And it's hard because we want to get the most complex plan up front. That's what we want to do. We're spending a lot of money, we're spending a lot of time, and we're getting a lot of people involved. Let's make this work really, really well off the get-go. But the problem with this is you don't know what you don't know. You have to start somewhere to see what you have to create the right classification levels over time. It's very easy to add, it's very hard to take away. So my suggestion is always start small, start with the obvious, see what you have, deal with the false positives, and move on and grow. The next element is roles. I touched upon this a little bit when I talked about classification that's driven by identities. This is another area where I also suggest start simple, mature, and grow over time. There are things that you know about your organization off the get-go, and every organization has a handful of roles that you know just exist. There's administrators, there's people that do payroll, there's an accounting department perhaps, maybe a marketing team. Those are all roles that are very well known and definable. But what you're going to notice again as you start simple and learn over time is that you're going to have unique roles specific to your organization as well. And they're going to have use cases that are specific to your organization as well. One of our customers, a financial firm, they learned that they have meteorologists that sit on their trading floor and study weather patterns. And that is how they understand how to trade certain types of natural gases and all sorts of different things. The technologists that were deploying data classification had no idea these people existed, but they are touching very sensitive data, and they came to know that by learning, by starting this project, analyzing the different infrastructures and organizations in their company, and learning as they go, and that's how you create a robust strategy. The next element of building a really good data classification program is making sure that you understand the infrastructure requirements. We're almost at the deployment phase here. We know that, we know at this point why it is that we're embarking on this strategy. We have our army ready to go. We even found the right software solution. We've developed our policy requirements for classification to start. And now what we want to do is make sure that all the back-end items are in place in order for us to be successful. My biggest recommendation is to do this before you deploy and overestimate a little bit. We always underestimate. If anyone has ever had to predict the size of a database or predict anything, you're always a little bit off. So I suggest overestimate. It's easier, much easier, to not utilize everything that you have than ask for more throughout an entire project. I've seen so many projects hit roadblocks and delays because the infrastructure requirements were not known up front and things were not provisioned ahead of time and the prerequisites were just not in place. On the left-hand side of this slide, we talk about the program team, and these are the folks that are going to dictate the project needs. Sometimes what they want is unrealistic from an infrastructure perspective. I mentioned earlier somebody that says, I want to restrict everything, I'm going to encrypt everything, and to a program manager without a big infrastructure background, they may think that that's a great risk reduction approach. But once you start talking to the next box here, the IT folks, they're going to start to tell you how that is not a realistic approach, and they'll be able to share with you the reasons why. But with information technology professionals, especially in support roles and operational roles, they care a lot about uptime and a lot about performance. And much of their success in their job roles are based on metrics related to uptime and availability. So they're going to be very strict on new applications, new agents, new anything that gets rolled out to their endpoints that they support. So you want to make sure that you have a healthy debate, again, up front, make sure everyone is in agreement, understand how the program team with their requirements and the information technology teams that are going to support those requirements are all going to work together to be effective. We're actually now at deploy and rollout. So it took a little while, but we made it. We're at the point now where we can start talking about deploying this approach and not just planning, but actually doing. So here we've labeled 6 action items that we suggest you take, and some of these, again, may be a little bit self-explanatory, and hopefully I can give just a little more clarity and insight into some of these to help you be more successful. The first one is around picking the people that are going to be part of your initial rollout. Here you can be slightly strategic, maybe even opportunistic, and pick a friendly team. Pick a place that you can hit a home run off the bat. With that friendly team, though, you have to be cognizant of number 2. They're going to give you tons of functionality requests, so many ideas about customizations, because I bet the people you're picking have a vested interest in the success of this project. So my big recommendation here would be to have a stopwatch. Let people give you feedback, and tons of it, but prioritize it and come up with a top 10 list like we've done here today of things that will help the bigger project, and also things that you logically and logistically can accomplish in a reasonable amount of time. The next element is making sure that you have the metrics and methods for making sure that you're successful. And of course, make sure we define what is considered success. For the information technology teams, it's going to be, did this system not crash my hosts? Are my servers still up and running without performance degradation? For the program managers, that may be more in line with how many sensitive files were out there that we didn't know about that we have now found. And maybe the CISO or folks in the security arm of your company are going to say, okay, let's talk about what we did with that information. We were able to lock down access to 80% of the sensitive files that we found, and we've done entitlement reviews on those, and we have ownership, etc. A lot of times, even we get brought in on that very scoped piece of work as the reactionary team and figuring out all of that. And again, we are part of that number 3. We get measured by those metrics as well. Number 4, figuring out who can vouch for my success. Is it the business user? Is it the information risk team? Is it some liaison that sits in between information technology and the business? And then number 5 is talking a little bit more about the ability to be comfortable with starting simple, learning as you go, and refining over time. At this point, you're ready to push your software out to your business community. One of the important elements before you deploy your software, or in conjunction with deploying your software, is education. End user training is really important. Awareness is key, and I always like the top-down approach. Advice, cooperation, even just commitment, basic commitment of tasks, is going to be adhered to when your manager tells you to do it, as opposed to some Joe Schmo in IT security that I've never heard their name before. So have the leaders of your business units preach this information from the top down, and that is how you will be successful. The other element of your deployment and rollout is make sure you're always looking for the flaws and mistakes as well. They will be there. I mentioned false positives a number of times, and you will have that. Instead of brushing them under the rug, put a big magnifying glass on them and see how many you can figure out or resolve for this next batch of rollouts that you're going to be doing. Training is something I talked about a moment ago when I was talking about the end user training, the business community, the folks that are going to be asked to change their behaviors. But really it's multifaceted, and there's a lot of different work streams when it comes to training the right personnel. The end user is absolutely important. We just talked about that a moment ago, and awareness and a top-down approach is key. But there's a few other ways that you can train your end users that I found have been incredibly successful. One thing that we always add to a training or a awareness program or any sort of campaign, which may be considered slightly unorthodox, is we share war stories. Our end users are being asked to do a lot. When they get onboarded, they spend weeks doing new hire training and filling out forms and telling, the compliance department every trade they've made and everything, anti-bribery presentations, you name it, they go through it. And they're asked to continuously do this every quarter, twice a year, however many times it is. And those are all really important, but you can probably start to imagine that it's time-consuming, it bogs them down, and sometimes from their perspective, it takes them away for the reason that they're at the organization if they're not in the IT technology side of the house. So sharing a little bit that's related to your industry is huge. If you're a retail company, talk about the Target breach. If you're a media company, talk about the Sony breach. Or if it's a government organization, the Snowden incident is so well known. The Panama Papers are also so well known. And it all has to do with data and managing the security and governance of your data. The administrator is also very important. You want to make sure that the folks that are operating your solution know what's going on. They're the people that have to keep the lights on, but also have this new amazing tool in place that's working and operating correctly. The help desk is the third element here. They're so important. They're your first line of defense. Those are the people that get the phone call, that get asked the questions, and they can turn a project around for you because they know how to answer even simple questions. So make sure that your support teams know what's going on. With ongoing support and maintenance, once you start deploying your solution, you want to make sure, and ongoing is of course the key word here, that you're doing tons of analytics as you go on. Don't stop all the exercises that you've done during planning just because you've started your rollout. Make sure you're constantly doing research, you're comparing your results to past benchmarks, and continuously improve. You want to make sure that you're always going to find new scenarios that pop up. I mentioned starting simple in terms of classification levels and developing them. I've talked about starting simple with defining your roles. And as you go, you will find new examples, new scenarios. At the financial firm customer I shared earlier, they found a team of meteorologists. Who knew that a financial services company has weathermen on their trading floor? But we figured that out. You want to make sure that the reactionary teams are there as well. The peripheral organization that's going to act on scenarios. The common example, if a sensitive file was emailed externally or printed, who is responsible for actioning that incident? Is it a SOC team? Is an incident occurred? Is an event triggered? And always continuously measure your effectiveness of all of the things that you're doing. Now, how will you know if you're stable or even improve your overall security posture as a whole? You need ways to effectively get those metrics and those measurements. I have a handful of ideas here that are very useful, but I tend to take metrics and measurements and look at them in two different buckets, let's say. One is the technical measurements, and that's pulling information from different data sources and not just knowing how many files are classified, but who's acting on those files. So when we talked about doing it based on roles, pulling information from Active Directory or different books of records, and how do I know that all these people are part of my data classification program? That's a great measurement that you can take. The non-technical measurements are more around the business side of it. Is risk actually being reduced? Are we seeing trends in our organization over the course of a year that incidents have been decreased? Is my business community cooperating? If we're asking our end users to flag and tag data, do we see them actually doing it? And what are the results of that? And how can we get them to do more if that's what we need them to do? Improving continuously. I've mentioned this a number of times. You're probably so sick of hearing me say this, but it's so important to learn and adapt and improve over time. The first way to make sure that you're improving continuously is to measure. Did I do what I aimed to do initially? When I set up my prerequisites and my project objectives and I set my scope, did I accomplish what I came here to accomplish? Then you want to start to thinking about how can I get better now with what I am already doing. So make those modifications and those refinements. The last element takes you just a step further, and you have to ask yourself the question, what else can I do to make my solution broader? If you were focusing initially on a target set of users, can I expand that? Do I have more use cases? If I was just focusing on file shares and unstructured data, can I now look at SharePoint as well? So making sure that you're broadening and going deeper as you start to improve within your program. So just to recap, we've gone through 10 best practices, or as I called them, steps in a process, to having an effective data classification program. I think all of these are really important. I wouldn't suggest skipping any. But without further ado, we'd like to open it up for some questions. I have a few people here as well, George, our moderator, myself. I have Rosario Mastrogiacomo on the phone as well. He's our resident subject matter expert on data classification and also watchful software. So anything I can't answer technically, he'll absolutely jump in to assist.
Thank you, Rita, for that fascinating presentation on the top 10 best practices in data classification. We have one or two questions coming in, so please give us a moment to sort it out, and we'll address your questions in the sequence we received. Okay, so we have some questions coming in, and the first question we have coming in is, how do I reduce false positives during a DLP scan? And I'd like to throw it out to Rita and whoever else would like to answer it as well.
Sure, so I can start, and then David or Rosario, if you want to chime in afterwards, by all means. False positives, I actually talked about that a number of times. That's a very good question, and you know, I'd be lying if there was a way to get rid of false positives altogether. There really is no real silver bullet, but with the right tooling, you can absolutely drastically improve the occurrence of false positives. And where I've seen a lot of false positives is with those DLP 1.0 scanning technologies that I talked about earlier. And I did mention that there are smarter, more pinpointed ways, like using dynamic data classification from RightsWatch, which embeds metadata into files that can be used to enhance the accuracy of those existing DLP 1.0 tools. So I think that you will always get false positives. You're going to constantly want to analyze them and improve as you go. But there are ways, like I mentioned earlier, with the right tooling where you can reduce the occurrence of that up front.
Thank you. The next question I have, how do you actually classify a document? Is the file encapsulated, tagged? Does this carry over to the documents sent outside the enterprise?
Sure, so I can start, and again, if anyone wants to add to it, please go ahead and do so. There's a number of ways to classify data. There are tools that will physically add metadata to a file based on the rules that you set in that tool. You can even have your end users say this specific document is sensitive, and there are tools out there that do that. The way you can do it with watchful software, there's a handful of ways there as well, but you can even have it recognize sensitive data as somebody's typing it. If someone's typing a social security number, for example, it can automatically do a certain set of actions like lock it down, not allow them to perform certain actions. There are also other tools out there that don't actually touch or modify the file, but have it a record that the data is classified in their own system, which can then integrate with other technologies as well. So there's a lot of different tools out there. You have to think about what's best for your organization. I don't think there's one tool that will answer every question, solve every problem for you. What I've seen work best is a combination of multiple solutions, and let the experts do what they do best, and try to integrate as much as you can.
Yeah, just to add, this is Rosario. One of the things that we really like about Watchful is that it is non-intrusive in that it doesn't require a lot of overhead from the end user, but the end user is exposed to what's happening so that, again, what Rita mentioned about awareness and letting people know, why you're doing this, that you're protecting the firm. So Watchful is very good about being non-intrusive, but at the same time letting the user know we are protecting your document.
Great. Next question I have. My business is not subject to common rules like PCI or HIPAA, but I need to protect proprietary data. How do I do this?
Sure. So there's a lot of DLP 2.0 technologies that offer the ability to classify data based on content and based on role. And again, it doesn't always have to be PCI or HIPAA related information. A lot of times the reasons that people embark on these specific programs is actually to protect intellectual property and potentially to prevent any sort of reputational issues with information exposed that shouldn't be exposed. So those are the types of scenarios that will be the why you're doing this. And the how you're doing it, again, going back to content and role, maybe data that's created by a developer that's documenting source code or communicating with people in your C-suite. Maybe they need to have higher levels of classification that automatically are applied to your data. So you want to think about what people are creating that is important to your company, and also the roles of those people, and you'll be able to do a ton of investigation and finding what you need to find, even if you don't have a regulatory body that's enforcing this upon you.
I think this is David Thorne. This is David from Watchful Software. I think it's also important to note that it also applies to archives or assets that you have in a file folder somewhere. It's not just stuff that you're creating on the fly, although that adds a considerable amount of value to what protecting data is all about, doing it in real time at creation. But it's also important because the vast majority of a lot of companies' data lives in files and folders. I was talking to a company earlier in the week, and they were talking about stuff that they've had since the inception of their company, which is over 100 years old. So it is important to protect that information that people still have access to that may not be something that you can create or classify or protect in real time. So you also, and that is something that I think that you need to determine at the outset, is what assets you do want to protect and where they live.
Rosario, would you like to add anything?
No, I think that pretty much covers everything.
Okay. The final question we have coming in: what do I do if a group of business users try to reject implementation of a classification software?
So I've mentioned this also in the slides today, that you're going to get resistance. Anything that is even slightly adjusting the way somebody works or what you're asking them to do, you will potentially get some resistance by the business. And again, we do encounter this frequently. That's why we emphasize finding the right team to start with, making sure that the education and training that you're deploying is top down. So we're asking the managers to share with their respective teams what's expected of them, and also include some of those war stories that people understand why it is that we're asking them to do something. And this level of engagement that happens early on and throughout between information security, IT, the business side, is also going to ultimately let the resistors that are requesting the solution to potentially be halted to understand, how their involvement will ultimately protect the company, protect the data that they create, and ultimately their jobs.
I would say there's a lot to do with the ease of use, the amount of the amount to which you don't disrupt their normal workflow. So if you're doing something that is familiar to your user, providing them an environment that doesn't require much change, or an environment that educates them as to changes that are happening and why those changes are happening and why it's germane to the business. And there's also an implied level of trust from the user that our organization cares about protection. Our organization believes that certain information is proprietary. It's intellectual property. A lot of companies today, their information is the second most important asset that they have, next to their people, right? And there are a lot of companies that information is their asset. The keys to the kingdom are their intellectual property, whether it's their code, whether it's their formula, whether it's their marketing strategy. These are the things that set one business apart from the next, and these are the things that great new innovations are born of. So it's important that your people understand that this is not a trivial matter, and to some extent that this isn't really an optional matter. Like someone said, people do like to resist change, but if you tell them why that change is good for them, good for the company, good ultimately for the valuation of the company, if it's a public company, I think that they'll climb on board, and you'll have a considerably larger user uptake or adoption of your implementation.
Yeah, just to add to that, this is probably one of the easiest upgrade/deployments that you would face compared to, let's say you're upgrading a version of the browser or you're upgrading a version of Office. You're always going to have the individuals who say, well, everything's working fine. Why do you have to upgrade me? And then you have to go into all these discussions about why it's necessary from a security perspective and management perspective. Whereas this is something that it's not just about protecting the firm. If it's something like, for example, where Watchful will classify emails before they go out and let you know that you're sending out confidential information, this is protecting the individual's reputation just as much as protecting the firm's reputation. Accidentally sending in a social security number, for example, out to via email to a client and not realizing it because you thought that you were sending it to someone else is something that allows the individual to protect themselves as well as the firm.
Great, great. As that is the last question, that concludes our webinar for today. I would like to thank our featured speaker, Rita Gurevich, founder and president of Sphere Technology Solutions, for delivering a fascinating presentation today, and to our partners at Watchful Software. A replay of this webinar will be posted on both the Watchful website at www.watchfulsoftware.com and on the Sphere Technology Solutions website at www.sphereco.com. Thank you, and we hope you have a great afternoon.